So many things have happened, and I'm trying to get everything into an order that will make sense. So buckle up, this is going to be a long one. I didn't know whether to run or hide when Gidget told me, by association, that GM was nearby. I was absolutely terrified, and my main thought was to protect Gidget. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely pack. But luckily, I hadn't brought much with me, and hadn't unpacked much when we had arrived. I had chosen flight over fight, and whilst running away wouldn't solve things, I didn't know what else to do. I packed Gidget's boards, including the new buttons, and hefted my bags and Gidget at the same time. She was shaking, and evidently terrified. But she was stronger than me. Despite her trembling, she didn't cower into me. She braced her paws against my shoulder where I'd slung her and lifted her head, chin high, to face wherever might be creeping on us. Gidget is a ride or die kind of dog. I could feel that GM was close. Whether that was some kind of sixth sense or just my faith in Gidget's senses still wasn't clear to me. But I ran. I packed up my car, strapped us both in. I felt sick to my stomach. I had an image of GM in my head, filthy and murderous, lurching towards our location with a knife held at her side. She had been searching all week, and now she had found us. I drove without any hesitation in mind, and the further we got from the motel, the more Gidget relaxed. She didn't sleep once the danger was over, merely lay down on her seat, eyes open and stared at me, but the tension had gone from her body, and that had to mean something. I was still scared. I felt, though GM was still hunting us, following the trail of our souls like some kind of psychic bloodhound, and I knew me and Gidget could not last on the road. One can't run forever. I found a new motel and checked in. I didn't want to think about it, was too tired to think about anything at all. But I knew whatever I had to do had to be resolved quickly. So I settled us in, laid out Gidget's board, and returned to Google. I had given up trying to explain everything logically. I'd never considered being in this type of situation, and I was running out of sensible options, so I followed my instincts and searched demonic possession. It felt strange to do, and I wanted to deny that it could be real, but I did it anyway. My decision was partially influenced by the appearance of a new Google logo that merely consisted of the words "Open the door" spelled out in black letters against a foggy background. It was disturbing to see, but at one point, I was very nearly done with the whole thing. I was exhausted and hungry and scared, but seeing GM's obvious message just made me roll my eyes. Whatever was in GM was too slow and very repetitive. After an hour or so of reading, I did another quick Google search and found some shops within driving distance that might have the things that I needed. I had driven too far from for GM to be able to catch us too quickly, so I wasn't too concerned about Gidget's safety, but I was concerned about her mental state. I explained to her that I was going out for a while, and that I wouldn't be for very long. I might have found it strange once upon a time to be conversing so earnestly with the dog, but Gidget had shown me how much she was capable of understanding. She listened carefully to my words, yawned, licked my hand, and then fell asleep. That was an indication as any that she was safe. I trusted her instincts. I bought the crucifixes at the religious supply shop. I had no idea that such stores existed, and the fact that one should be so close to where I was staying made me decide it was some kind of omen. I got a big crucifix made of wood, with a realistic Jesus carved on it. Someone had put far too much effort into chiseling abs onto him. I also got 2 silver crucifix necklaces, a larger one for me, and a small one that I could attach to Gidget's collar. I bought a Bible too, just in case it came in handy. I felt like I was stocking up for a vampire attack. At that point, I wouldn't have been surprised if the shop had also sold pre-sharpened steaks. My next stop was a place that sold herbs. I bought a bunch of white sage that I wasn't sure what I was going to do with, but which had seemed important according to what I'd read online. On the way home, I stopped at a church along the way. I had a large water bottle in the car which was nearly empty, so I drank the contents and I went into the church. The font was by the door, so was a priest. I wasn't sure what to say to him. but I held up my water bottle and asked if I could feel it. I thought I might have to be sneaky or come up with a valid excuse, but he waved me in without any comment or judgment. He watched me as I held the neck of the bottle underwater. "House haunted?" he asked with a half smile. "Friend possessed," I said, and we both laughed. I could have asked him for help, I suppose, but it all seems fantastical. It didn't occur to me. I should have really asked him for help. Instead, I went back to the motel and Gidget was still asleep, and whilst I didn't want to wake her, I did want to make sure she was protected. The first thing that I did was slide the smaller crucifix off chain and clip it onto her collar, right next to the tag with her name on it. She wagged her tail at me. I hoped it would be enough for now. The second thing that I did was to use the holy water. I wasn't sure where to use it. I had thought about the motel doorways, but I couldn't be certain how many ways in there were. So I settled for pouring a line across the doorway of her room and splashing the door and door handle liberally on both sides. I did glance at the window too, but we were on the third floor, so I didn't think it would be a problem. There was quite a lot of holy water left, so I put it on my bedside cabinet and made a mental note to remind myself not to drink it. After that, there was not much else to do. I fed Gidget, ate something myself, which was difficult with the way my stomach was curdling, and lay down on the bed. Gidget did not have her own bed this time, so she climbed up with me, and it was unspeakably comforting to have her warm fuzzy body nestled next to me. I decided, when all this was over, I would get a dog of my own. I hadn't intended to fall asleep, but the stress must have shut my body down. Because the next thing I knew, it was dark, and I wasn't in my bed. Instead, I appeared to be floating high above an unfamiliar road, and after the initial panic, I realized I must be dreaming and forced myself to relax. The road was mostly empty, a few cars parked along the curbs, and streetlights dotted lining it. Nothing to catch the attention apart from the lone figure toiling along. Even from a distance, the figure looked familiar, and the recognition seemed to be responsible for drifting down and drawing closer. It was GM, still dressed in her stained sweats, her hair even more matted than when I had seen her before. She was walking with an uneven but somehow inexorable stride, rolling from side to side, yet making good speed. One hand was swinging next to her, fingers cuddled into a loose fist. The other was deep into the pouch of her hoodie. With the curious knowledge of dreams, I felt like I knew that what she was clutching in there, and that it was for me. I shouldn't have been able to hear her from that height, but I could. She was panting and muttering in a low voice, and although I could not make out any real words, she sounded angry, and her voice sounded a lot deeper than it had before. I didn't want to get closer. I felt like if I did, she would sense my presence like Sauron when Frodo put the ring on. But curiosity got the better of me. It was a dream, I reasoned. Scary, yes, but still just a dream. So I went down until I was just ahead of her, seemingly hovering a few feet above the ground. A car drove past without even slowing, which cemented the idea that I couldn't be seen. GM was twitching her head as she walked. Abrupt little jerks that made her face blur, and something about the way that happened made me extremely uneasy. I wanted to see her face. I felt like if I could, it would give me more of an idea of her mental state. As she grew closer to where I floated, she faltered, feet stumbling ever so slightly. Did she sense that I was there? I could now see, in the false yellow light of the street lamps, that her shoes were stained dark, and I was horrified when I realized that she had walked so far. Her feet were bleeding. GM started forwarding again, and with even more urgency than before. Her hand was coming out of her pocket, and I saw a dull gleam. She was coming towards me. She could see me now. I panicked, willing myself to fly up to the place where I had been before. But whether my fear was keeping me there, a rabbit in the headlights, or GM was holding me down somehow, I couldn't be sure. I could see her face as the headlights of another passing car illuminated it. The glint of her eyes. They weren't completely black, like I had somehow expected. just her normal eyes, but somehow they still managed to convey utter madness. "You," she growled, and whatever was in her hand sliced the fabric of her hoodie as it came free. And it wasn't until she was right on top of me that I managed to break the hold of gravity that had over me. I shot upwards with sickening speed, heading for the stars, but not before one of her hands brushed my foot, going straight through it. I woke up in the motorroom, my heart hammering away against my ribs, my breath scorching my throat. When I had fallen asleep, Gidget had been nestled in the crook of my arm. But now I was hugging her close, and she was whining, tongue licking up my face. It had to have been just a dream, I told myself. But even if it had been, it was one I never wanted to have again. It had been creepy enough, but the worst part was when GM had touched my foot at the very end. She hadn't made purchase, as I was just in my dream body, but it was still enough to transfer everything that was happening inside her, and there was a lot going on. I felt her pain first. She had indeed bled through her shoes and was walking in a gelid layer of it, grinding on the small bones that, from the loose way they floated, felt like they could be broken. The tendons and muscles in her legs were surely torn, and it felt like she had a permanent cramp. She was starving too, and thirsty. The thing controlling her hadn't let her eat or drink. It didn't care about her. She was just a vessel, and it would push her as far as it wanted until she was dead. Maybe then it would vacate the lifeless meat of her body. The second thing I felt was the entity itself. It was angry, but it also felt anger, hate, were the only things that it ever felt. A constant state of being. I saw in whatever passed for its mind what it intended to do to me and Gidget, and there would be no mercy, no hesitation. We had done nothing to deserve it except escape. I was glad I had only felt it for a split second. Had I felt it in motion for a longer period, I think I would have gone insane. It was a miracle GM had held out for so long. But horrible as the pain and the entity's spite had felt, the third thing I had sensed before quitting the scene was somehow far worse. I had felt GM herself, a scratchy little scream buried down deep inside the whole mess. I don't know if it was her consciousness, or if it could truly be her soul, but I could hear her shrieking as if she were at the end of a very long tunnel, but not robbed of any of its horror for all that. I didn't know if GM could ever come back from that place, physically or mentally. Even if the entity was driven out, her physical body had sustained so much abuse from the inhuman puppeteer commanding it that I felt sure her internal organs would be shutting down, and her mind, I thought it might be completely broken. I hugged Gidget tight. There'd be no more running. It had to end. The showdown came a day later. The entity must have pushed GM's body to unnatural limits in order to get to where we were soon. But I was glad in a way when it finally arrived. I had been scared for too long, and Gidget had been even more anxious the closer it got. The tension had been unbearable. Gidget alerted me to our visitor around 3 a.m. Neither of us had been able to sleep, and Gidget had been pacing up and down, but she stopped in her tracks, the fuzzy fur on her back standing up, and stalked over to her board. "Mom, home," she said. I wasn't at all surprised. There was a chair in the room I had wedged against that already locked motel room door, but now I retrieved it and turned to face the entrance. I sat down, Gidget at my feet, the Bible on my lap, the big wooden crucifix clutched in both hands, and waited. It didn't take long for me to pick up on the presence of the thing inside GM. Gidget had felt it sooner, because her senses were more attuned. But there was no mistaking the dread rising up in my belly. It tasted like bile, and I felt like I would vomit. There was a smell that might have been real, might have been my mind, but it was strong and foul. I kept my eyes fixed on the door. Would I open it when it knocked? That was the whole point, after all. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, over and over, notification after notification, until the vibrations carried it over to the edge onto the floor, where it continued to report. I didn't need to read the messages to know what they said. It wanted me to open the door. There was a little time left. Get on the bed, Gidget, I told her. The bed was farther away from the door, and I didn't want her to be the first thing GM saw. Gidget whined and remained where she was. I mean it, Gidget. Good girl. Go and get on the bed. I'll deal with Mom. She complied with obvious reluctance. She looked so small on the big bed, I thought as I looked back over my shoulder at her. Just a tiny little floof. Ball of yarn. I smiled at her. I was still smiling when the shadow appeared in the window by my bed. We were on the third floor. The window shouldn't have been a problem. I had checked. You see? Checked for drain pipe or fire escapes or anything like that. And it was just wall all the way up to our window. But it didn't seem to have stopped GM. She had somehow climbed up there, and she hung, framed in the window, grinning at us. I saw her very clearly before the light went out and the window broke. She had lost so much weight. Didn't seem possible. And her skin hung on her bones. Two of her front teeth were broken, and the jagged edges snashed at her bottom lip as she smiled. One bloody hand lifted in a wave, and so she was hanging onto the windowsill with the other. Her nails were missing, no doubt from her impossible climb, and the spongy fingertips touched the windows, daubing a crooked smiley face on the glass. The light went out then, just as her hand was doubling into a fist and drawing back, and I got out of my chair so quickly it toppled, the Bible falling from my lap. The crash seemed deafening in the small place. I could see very little, the only light coming from a distant street lamp, but it was enough to see the hunched shadow that had once been my friend launched itself through the window. The broken glass still in the window frame had formed a long spears. That didn't deter her, but they did slow her down. She was reaching for Gidget with frantic and grabby hands, but the glass pierced her and held her in place like a beetle on a pin. I didn't have time to process what was happening, or to make an informed plan of action, but I did the only thing I could. I hadn't been sure when I bought it what use the huge crucifix would be, but it turned out it was very useful indeed at knocking GM right the fuck up. Gidget hadn't moved. As tiny as she was, she had faced a threat with the spirit of a Caucasian mastiff. And even when GM was still, she didn't let her guard down. GM's hand was just about bridged the gap between the window and the bed, leaving bloody handprints on the covers. But now they dropped onto the floor. She hung over the sill, hair dangling and arms limp. And I didn't know what to do. I'll be honest, I thought about hitting her again. Hitting her as many times as it needed to finally set her free. But she had once been my friend. More practically, my knowledge of the law was sketchy when it came bludgeoning intruders to death. So I called the police instead, and took a look at what I had to hand. I doused her with holy water first. Her body twitched at that. She let out a feeble cry, trying to lift her head. My instinct to help her was strong. She sounded pathetic, but I wasn't going to get much closer than I already was. I remembered the sage too. In the long stretching minutes before I could hear her approaching sirens in the distance, thought I might as well use it as it was there. I lit it, and I produced a thick plume of smoke that almost immediately set off the smoke alarm. But I tried to ignore the piercing beeps and reached out at the arm's length to waft the smoke towards GM. It drifted in lazy curls, and I watched it, mesmerized. It wanted to go straight out of the window. So I bent and swished the glowing bundle lower. The smoke swirled and settled around GM's head. She reacted again then, lifting her head and fixing me with a furious gaze. Her eyes were bulging so much I didn't think she could actually close the lids. And there was blood that looked black in the half light pouring from her mouth. One of her hands snatched up from the floor, managed to snag my ankle, pulling me over. There was broken glass everywhere, and I only dimly felt the shards scraping my back as she started to drag me towards her with strength that was ridiculous considering her condition. I screamed for help, hoping someone was near enough to come to my aid, and tried to grab at the big crucifix, which I had put down to tent staging, but it was just out of reach. I kicked at her face, feeling the crunch as a couple more of her teeth shattered, but she spat blood at me and carried on pulling. It was Gidget that managed to stop her. The tiny dog hurled herself from the bed, ears flying, small teeth snapping, and clamped her jaw right there on GM's wrist. GM shouted, not from pain but from rage, released my ankle to shake Gidget loose. Her fingers were twitching to reach Gidget's collar, but she shrieked again when the little crucifix next to her Gidget's name tag touched her skin. She threw her arm back, intending to smash Gidget against the wall, but Gidget let go of her wrist just before the impact and rolled away unharmed. I grabbed the crucifix then, scrambling my way through the broken glass until I reached it, and I was just about to smash GM over the head with it again and when the police arrived. I'm told they had to wrestle it from my hands, but I don't remember much about that. And now we're pretty much up to date. Apart from the aftermath, I was very tired after writing all this, so I will just give you a brief summary as I can, whilst hopefully covering anything. GM is dead, not from the blow to the head I gave her with the crucifix, but from the deterioration and damage to her body had undergone whilst under the power of the entity, combined with the injuries from the broken glass. They did all they could to save her. She was too far gone. They said it was astonishing that she'd managed to do the things she had done in her condition. The authorities are staunchly blaming. And I suppose it's a reasonable conclusion under the circumstances. But it's not the truth. I was there, and I saw the entity leave her body once the vessel was of no use to it anymore. I remember that part. Nobody else saw it. I think that maybe my own mental state had heightened my ability so much under all the stress that I was momentarily given the power. It was a blurred thing, dark, very dark. Some might have mistaken it for a shadow cast by the beam of the police flashlights as they shone them into the small motel room, but it twisted in the opposite direction that a shadow should have, dancing crazily as it detached, almost too fast for the human eye to perceive. Something about the movement made me sick to my very stomach. As I closed my eyes, but in the last second before I shut it out, it turned and acknowledged me. GM died a couple of days later, in a hospital bed surrounded by friends. She never regained consciousness after the entity left her, and I'm glad of that. The torture she had been through had ended. I remained in hospital for a couple of days. Most of my injuries were superficial cuts from the broken glass, although there was one gash that had needed several stitches, and there was a bruise around my ankle, in the perfect shape of a handprint that faded after only a day. Physically, I am sore, but more or less okay. Mentally, not so much. Gidget's family decided I should adopt her, and that's something I gladly accepted. The little dog and I had become close during a hard time, and I was happy to move all our things into my own home. At some point during the commotion at the motel, she lost a crucifix on her collar, so I'm going to get her another one just to be safe. I know GM is gone now, but I think it's important. Gidget is in pretty much the same condition as myself. Physically okay, mentally not so much. She has been distant and very quiet in the period since we came home. She hasn't had any cuddles, and has kept very much to herself. Neither has she used her board, but I have hopes she will settle down soon. I intend to give her all the love GM gave her, and more. She will be safe with me. Update: Gidget used her board today for the first time. She asked for a treat and got her request. I think things are looking up. Day 2. I might need some advice. Does anyone know how these boards work? I've read about the instruction booklet over and over, changed batteries in the buttons, but they kept glitching or something. I know it's probably something in the electronics, but to be honest, it's starting to creep me out. The buttons keep saying stuff that I'm pretty sure GM didn't record, and it doesn't even sound like her voice. Maybe she did it when she was halfway under? Update 3. One of the buttons I recorded myself has started to do the same thing, same voice. The things they say are reasonably upsetting. Gidget is using the board very strangely. I can't quite explain how, but she doesn't just hit the buttons. She'll stand staring at me for a long time. Then just when I'm getting really freaked, she'll press a button without looking at the board, watching for my reaction the whole time. I really want to be wrong, honestly. I do. but the way Gidget keeps looking at me, I keep wondering where that entity went after it left GM. Stupid, I know, but still, I think I might need to get some holy water, just in case. And it might be a coincidence, but Gidget's far looks darker somehow.